Oh.
I'm actually going to take a fairly narrow view of what I talk about, partly because that's what I was asked to do, and partly because there's a tendency after an event like Paris last Friday to start meshing issues in all different kinds of ways and confusing issues. So I'm going to limit myself, at least in what I say, and then Q&A can go anywhere you want, to Iran and the Iran deal and the aftermath of the Iran deal. Because it's important for itself. It's not just important for Paris or ISIS or whatever. So when the Obama administration pursued this deal and agreed to this deal, remember, nobody has signed this deal, one of the things that he and the State Department tried to make clear to opponents of the deal was that if you just got rid of this nuclear thing, if you just got rid of this little problem we have with Iran about their nuclear capabilities, all kinds of other avenues would open up for constructive and productive U.S.-Iranian relations. You could make Iran part of the family of nations again. That's what they said. That's what they pursued. And because they said that, they said, then we're not going to attach anything else to the actual Iran deal. We were just going to talk about nuclear capabilities, which turned out not to be true because they did ballistic missiles, but that's what they told us. So it's worth looking at, first of all, what happened since the deal in two ways: the deal itself and those other things that the president suggested would come to fruition after we made an agreement with Iran. In terms of the deal itself, there was something called the roadmap. Technically, it's called the Roadmap for the Clarification of Past and Present Outstanding Issues Regarding Iran's Nuclear Program, shortly known as the Roadmap. That's a set of 12 concerns that the IAEA had, which need to be resolved before, technically speaking, sanctions are lifted, although many sanctions have already been lifted. Iran started decommissioning centrifuges in October, and you could see a flurry of positive press reports about how much safer we are. By the way, they only decommissioned, they only took offline those that were already decommissioned. On October 5th, they stopped decommissioning. So they get a little burst of this, they got the publicity from that. But the IAEA announced on October 15th that in the period up to October 15th, 2015, activities set out in the roadmap document were completed, leading people to believe that Iran had answered the 12 questions. That is not true. They have answered none of the 12 questions. What that meant was Iran has completed the process of telling the IAEA what it will tell them about the 12 questions. Okay? They are not required to actually answer the 12 questions until January, which is called Implementation Day. There is a report out this week by CSIS that says that although Iran might meet the requirements of the roadmap to actually tell the IAEA what it's going to tell them by January, it's unlikely, because some of those questions are exceedingly complicated and they have to do with Natanz and Fordow and Arak and places that nobody can go. So it's unlikely that they will meet the deadline of January 15th. But that doesn't really matter, because even if they meet the deadline of January 15th, 16th, that only brings you to the beginning of the next process for the IAEA. So all of these processes are strung out. Now, we would normally not care, except that Iran says, as long as they're answering the IAEA's questions, and as long as they are in conversation with the IAEA, they don't have to do the things they promised us under the JCPOA, because those are two different things. There's the roadmap over here, and there's the JCPOA over there. They have done none of the things they promised us that they would do under the terms of the JCPOA. Not reducing their enriched product, not shipping uranium out of the country, not decommissioning centrifuges. None of those things have happened. So that's where we are on the actual deal. It is as if it was never signed. Oh, it wasn't ever signed. So what do we say? It's as if it never happened. It was a dream. I don't know. It was a vision. It was a monster movie. I don't know. Nothing has happened. And the IAEA awaits answers to its questions. So then you might guess that because they have not proceeded to do any of the things that they were required to do by the JCPOA, you might assume that none of the other things have happened either. Correct. None of the other things have happened either. The opposite. They have gone backwards. Setting aside nasty rhetoric, which you shouldn't, but I will just because we don't have a lot of time. Setting aside nasty rhetoric, setting aside the demonstrations against the United States on the anniversary of the taking of the embassy, Iran has done a couple of things that we should consider extremely important. First of all, they arrested 2 more people. One is an Iranian American. One is actually Lebanese, who has permanent residence in the United States. But these are two people for whom the United States government bears some responsibility. Interestingly, both of them were in favor of better relations between Iran and the United States. Nizar Zakha was a member of an organization, the Iranian American, promoting better ties between Iran and the United States. So you ask yourself, why is this guy arrested? He was there on a state-sponsored trip. He came to make things better. He came to encourage business. Oh, he came to encourage business. There is some pushback against the deal inside of Iran, and it comes from the IRGC. It is not security-related. It's economic-related. The IRGC does not want an opening of economic relations between the United States and Iran because they have a monopoly on everything at the moment. And anything that works to improve the ability of American companies or European companies to come into the Iranian market is likely to dilute the monopoly of the IRGC. So that is the argument that's going on inside of Iran. These two guys were working for better and more open economic relations. The IRGC does not want that. Other things that have happened, Bahrain uncovered a plot. Bahrain being a Sunni-ruled Shiite majority country, an Iranian plot to overthrow the government. It is one of about 17 Iranian plots to overthrow the government of Bahrain. Iran has violated UN sanctions. They are shipping arms and ammunition to Hezbollah in Syria, which is by itself a violation of UN resolutions. It's happening on Russian airplanes, which is another violation of UN resolutions. Emanuele Ottolenghi at FDD has interactive maps. If you go online, go to FDD and go to Ottolenghi's page, you can see these maps about how the equipment is coming to Hezbollah in Syria. The explosion at the Damascus airport last week, orchestrated by the Israel Air Force, that was Hezbollah equipment. The Russians, by the way, have no problem with this. Interesting, the Russians have not objected to Israeli operations inside of Syria that are against Hezbollah, which is a whole different story and a whole different sort of understanding about the Middle East, but it's worth mentioning. The last thing that the Iranians have done, and this is the one that should concern us the most, is what they've done with their defense budget. The defense budget will grow by 1/3 next year. The assumption is that we will be releasing enough money for them to do that. I think they're right. The money will go to Russia and China. So it's bad in both directions. It is bad because it provides arms and equipment for Iran, but it's bad because it allows Russian and Chinese defense industries to operate at greater capacity and operate at greater profits. And we really didn't want that. We didn't want the Russians' defense industry to operate profitably. But it will, including very, very advanced fighter jets, which are a problem for the United States. And when people talk about, I'll just deviate a teeny bit here from Iran, when people talk about safe zones or air war over Syria or over Iraq or whatever you want to do with the United States, Russian planes, really, really, really good Russian planes, will make that a problem for us. If we and the Russians are not in agreement about what the United States is doing and who we are bombing, and at the moment we're not totally in agreement, those kinds of planes with which the Russians had been unable to produce in large numbers, they will now be able to produce in large numbers, and they are a match for anything that we put in that region. So that's a different kind of problem, but it stems from the problem of Iran having a lot of money to play with. Just on the side, there were 697 executions in Iran, mostly regime opponents, some homosexuals. You know, that's just what they do. And in November, Iran initiated a blockade of all U.S. goods to Iran. So if we were supposed to be changing the relationship, if we were supposed to be finding good things on the side, if we were supposed to be getting rid of this little nuclear thing so we could have the other, it didn't work. They have an embargo upon U.S. goods in Iran, so we did all of this for the benefit of European companies, which, by the way, is the same thing we did with Cuba, which continues to embargo U.S. goods from Cuba. Although we've said, please buy our stuff, they've said, no, thank you, we don't need your stuff. Iranians also. Last thought. Just so you don't think everything is going great for Iran and lousy for us, things are going lousy for us. They are not necessarily going great for Iran. The Iranians have lost a lot of IRGC higher-ups in Syria. At the end of October, about 30 high-ranking IRGC commanders were killed in that last week of October in Syria. They're not very good fighters. And I would remind you that the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s proved the Iranians were not very good soldiers. It's not good at it. Hezbollah is not very good at it either. The good news is they're not good at it either. The bad news is they have a lot of missiles, and so they don't need to be very good at it. So the Iranians are importing now to Syria Afghans and Nigerians, who I suspect are not going to turn out to be any better foot soldiers than Iranians. But the Russians are very angry with Iran. The Russians had expected Iran to take care of the ground war. The Russians had expected only to fly a few sorties to nail down their access to their base in Tartus and Latakia, and that somebody else was going to be fighting on the ground, and it was supposed to be Hezbollah and Iran, and they are not doing the job. So the Russians are finding themselves doing more sorties, but also now having to worry about whether they need to put foot soldiers on the ground. The Russian people do not like that. They will not like that. That will end up a problem for Russia. So the Iranians are now throwing Afghans and Nigerians into the fight in Syria, hoping to shore up their position on the ground. I don't think it will work. So Iran has continued to do what it did that we didn't approve of. They continue on the nuclear side. They continue to do what we don't approve of on the social, economic, and military side that are non-nuclear. And our response to this has been to announce that there will be no new sanctions. The president told a journalist that there will be no new sanctions, and to bring Iran into the Syrian peace talks. I would say that if I were Iran, despite the fact that I've lost some IRGC people, and despite the fact that the Russians are mad at me, not happy with me, the whole thing is a net for Iran. Financial, military, economic, political. I cannot find a way in which the Iranians have not benefited from the JCPOA and the changed U.S. posture, and I cannot find a way the Iranians have not benefited. I cannot find a way the United States has benefited. So on that cheerful note, I think that's where we are.
Shoshana, thank you very much. Let me ask the first question, if I may. As a serious student of this region, when you see the kind of humiliation of the United States that is involved in what you've just described, and I think you could have gone on with other examples. You mentioned the fact that they didn't sign the deal. They also didn't submit to the Majlis and the Guardian Council the same deal that was submitted up here. I mean, there's just been no end of affronts, really. But what does that mean in a geostrategic sense? Is it realistic to say that this is unlikely to produce better behavior when they get away with it? And perhaps contrary-wise, to actually cause much bigger problems down the road, especially once they're $150 billion richer?
You are the master of understatement. But what Claire and I were talking about before I stood up here was one of the things that happens when we are continually affronted by countries that really have no business affronting us is that we start to be embarrassed. We were saying that watching the president yesterday in his press conference was an embarrassment to us as Americans, which is a terrible, terrible thing to say. You can disagree with the president a lot, any president a lot, all the time.
Yo, Ace.
And the reason I look at it from this end, not that end, is because when we as Americans are embarrassed by our own government, we tend to not do the right things. We tend not to demand the right things of our government. We tend not to look for fixes. Yes, you know, we look pretty stupid up there. And yes, it degrades our position and our ability to do things. On the other hand, we are still the most powerful country in the world, should we choose to act as if we are. So I don't think anything that we've done, so we've made our lives more difficult. We have caused a lot of people great pain and anguish, and I mean that of millions and millions of Syrians and Iraqis and Afghans. But there's nothing that we've done that can't be undone. There's nothing that's not fixable. The problem is we need to decide to fix it. And in order to do that, you cannot have a dispirited population. This was the great, you know, everybody knows why Ronald Reagan was great, but one of the reasons that Ronald Reagan was great was he took office when we were utterly dispirited, and he gave us back our belief that we could do well and we could do good. Right now, it will be very hard for us to figure out how to do well and do good in the condition that we're in, and that, to me, is the biggest problem from all of this.
Thank you. Well said. Claire Lopez.
So if the United Nations, or I'm sorry, if the IAEA does not sign off on the completion of the 12 outstanding questions, I thought they'd answered one, so there's like 11 left, but does that mean that implementation day would be delayed?
Implementation date can be delayed. If the IAEA does not certify Iran, implementation date will be delayed, which means that at best, the Iranians will delay any interest they had in meeting the terms of the JCPOA. I'm more afraid, however, that the IAEA will cave to a variety of kinds of pressure and do the certification whether or not the 12 questions are answered. Amano is already out there saying, anybody see Walter Pincus this morning in the Washington Post? If you haven't, please go get your Washington Post and look at Walter Pincus, who has the most horrible column about the failure of the Iranians to meet the commitments under the JCPOA, but that's not the problem. The problem is that all of the enemies of Iran are going to use this as a reason to hate Iran even more. So never mind what they do or they don't do. It's going to be fodder for the conservatives in the United States, and it's going to be fodder for the conservatives inside of Iran, the people who hate Rouhani. And isn't it terrible that the people who don't like the deal are now going to have ammunition? That's what's wrong. It's a horrible column. So
It's a classic Pincus column,
it is a classic
in other words.
Pincus, it is a classic Pincus column. But in the column, there is some really important stuff in which the IAEA says things like, we don't need anybody to tell us how to do our job. We'll figure out how to do our job. We'll figure out what's important and what's not important. And when you have people in that position saying those kinds of things, you can bet that they're looking for ways to sign off. They're looking for a way to say that Iran is in compliance. They have another month to do it, 2 months to do it.
Admiral Lyon seems to have the microphone already. Rank has its
A
privilege.
couple of, could you talk about the intercontinental ballistic missile test they conducted? And with now Russia being somewhat teed off, will this have any impact on the transfer of the S-300 missiles?
The second, I think, is the more important question. I think it will have an impact. The Russians are not happy. The Russians made a choice between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam. They made the choice to go with Shiites because they really hate the Sunnis, because southern Russian Muslims are Sunni, and so that's the choice they made. But they don't have to like it, and they don't like it. It's also true that the Russians have made that S-300 deal 5 times, and they have yet to deliver them. So I think what the Russians really do is they tell you they will, and then they don't, and that's the good news.
Hopefully the Iranians have already paid for it.
I think they bought it.
Hopefully
on half.
5 times.
I don't think they paid 5 times. They're not. Yeah.
There's an ongoing dispute about that. That's one of the things they have to look at.
Yes, is the money.
Iran has sued.
Mike?
You can talk about it. Iran has sued the Russians, and the Russians are demanding that the suit be dropped as a condition of delivering the S-300. And that is not, the Iranians have not agreed to that. They think they've been economically damaged by the way that the deal went down. Go ahead and.
Yeah, no, you did it. You said it, Dan. Thank you. The Russians don't want to deliver it, and they're going to find ways to not deliver it, which is good. ICBM tests. Well, yeah. The Iranians plan to acquire as much capability as they can and as much as they can pay for, and the more money we give them, the more they acquire. So it's our problem. It's not just like a little thing, it's not just Israel's problem. Now it's everybody's problem, and most people don't want to look at it that way. But boy, you are right.
What was it, in fact, an ICBM?
I'm not
Or an
sure.
IRBM?
I am not sure, because the Iranians are also masters of making things look like what they're not. We've discovered in lots of cases when the Iranians said they had certain capabilities, they didn't have those. So the good news is they have some things, but they don't have other things. I would not bet that it was an ICBM test.
Sarah?
I'm so sorry. I missed the beginning of your brilliance.
Here, Sarah, you can have the notes.
Okay. Shoshana Bryen is one of the best assets we have in our side of the Atlantic, really. Anyway, I want to ask you, number one, what is implementation supposed to be? And number 2, I think Fred Fleitz and some of the other good people at the center might know this as well as you, Shoshana. If individual state governments levy their own sanctions, can they do that? There's no, okay, can we derail this, by having enough individual states levy their own sanctions? And I know that Fred Fleitz and the good people at the CSP have been doing a lot of work on this. And we all saw what Yigal Carmon had written in terms of the translation from Farsi about what, and so their understanding of the JCPOA is totally different from ours. So, is there another way to skin this cat?
I suppose, Fred, do you want to talk about state implementation?
Well, the Obama administration is going to claim that states can't not implement. The problem is that a lot of the laws being passed by these states have a waiver provision for the president, in terms of national security. The key is to get legislation passed in these states that does not have this waiver position. But I think I'd rather kick this to Frank, who I think has been working a little harder on this particular aspect of this question.
Well, I hate to say this, but for those of you who've been a little critical of AIPAC in connection with this deal, and I am among them, the reason we have this problem is that AIPAC insisted, when we and others were making the effort to engage states in what we call the Divest Terror Initiative or Divest Iran Initiative, which basically came down to having them preclude their public pension funds from doing business with companies that were investing in or doing business with Iran, or in the larger case of Divest Terror, other states that were on the state sponsor of terrorism list. And AIPAC, in its wisdom, insisted on bringing in a different bill that had, among other things, this waiver that basically said, as long as the president says it's in the national interest to have this kind of business take place, these prohibitions are suspended. So it's predictable that in, I think, all but one or two cases, maybe it's one, that will happen when the president decides that he will exercise that waiver authority, unless, in the meantime, these states can change their laws. Now, unfortunately, most of them don't reconvene their state legislatures until January or later. It should be noted, though, that 15 governors wrote the president saying that they stood by those laws. So exactly how that's going to sort itself out remains to be seen. But my hope is, Sarah, that one way or another, we will find a way to get the Iranians to say officially and formally the deal's off. They seem to be behaving as though the deal, such as it is off, as you've said, but getting it said officially would be helpful, obviously.
I don't think they're going to say it officially, frankly, for the same reason that I never thought they were going to sign it to begin with.
And they didn't.
And they didn't, and neither did we, by the way.
Nobody.
Nobody signed this deal, because it seemed to me that the Iranians would understand that we would begin to live by the provisions, even without our signature. It's a sort of gentleman's agreement. Well, you don't make a gentleman's agreement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they understood that they would begin to reap the benefits, even if they didn't sign. But then they can turn around and say, but as long as we haven't signed, we are not bound by the deal. Even, as Sarah points out correctly, even the terms of the deal as we have said it is in Farsi, which is much different than the deal reads in English. So the Iranians get the best of all, no signature, continue to do what they do, get the benefits from us because we are, I don't know, I don't want to say it, but we're too stupid to not give them to them.
And they rewrote the agreement.
And they rewrote the agreement. And Sarah, as for your other question, implementation day, yes, it does beg the question, implement what? And what is what's called the additional protocol. And that is another IAEA document. Once the questions are answered, these 12 questions or 11 remaining questions are answered for the IAEA, then you have to do something after that. Once the IAEA is up to here, then it has to go over to there with more things that the Iranians can and cannot do, should and should not do, and have to report. So that's called the additional protocol. Implementation day only brings you to the beginning of implementing the additional protocol. And again, the Iranians say, well, if we get to implementing the additional protocol, we have to do that before we can do the things under the JCPOA. So from the Iranian point of view, they've got loads of time.
Anyone else? Claire?
I'll just ask one sort of sum-up kind of question. You kind of listed what the Iranians have gotten out of this. Fundamentally, why would you say the Iranians entered into this process in the first place when they knew they were never going to sign anything. They knew they were never going to give up either their overt or their covert program. What propelled them to, enter into the process in the beginning?
Because I think they understood from the White House, from the president's emissaries, that entering the process would have benefits. If you enter the process, you will already begin to reap benefits. If you conclude the process, even more benefits. But as we go along in this process, you will begin to reap benefits. And in fact, they did. They have. They've gotten benefits all along, and I think they knew that. I think either they were specifically told that that would be the case, or they hoped it would be the case, and they understood this White House well enough to know. I would just point out to you that we had some early conversations with Hafez Assad in this administration, 2009, 10, when we were calling him a reformer. And the Syrians said, look, we have a terrorism problem, but if we could have better relations with you and you would take us off the terrorism supporting list, we could help you get rid of the terrorists. But you have to do something so that we understand that you appreciate our position. And so you know what we did? We lifted the embargo on airplane parts in 2010 or early 2011. We started selling them airplane parts. Well, that's, they fly those airplanes to drop barrel bombs. There's a direct link between this thing and that thing and the other thing. And the Syrians have not done any of that, but they understood that if they entered a process with the United States, we would pay up front. And we paid, and we paid in airplane parts. The Iranians understood the same thing. If you enter the process with us, it's already a win for you. So they did. That was not a positive question.
A corollary to that point,
Is it
Shoshana.
Wait.
Sorry.
The last thing I ever say when I stand on is that the question has to evoke from me a positive response so that I can leave feeling good about the last response that I give. So if this is a question that is going to evoke from me a negative response, you may want to rethink it.
Or you may not. You may not leave the podium.
I may not, but you
Look,
have other things to do.
Just again, what you've described is something, and I've been fooling around with various aspects of international agreements for about 40 years, I guess, but I've never seen anything like this, where you don't have anybody signing the agreement, you don't have agreement on what the agreement is, you don't have it being implemented, you have the parties violating, the party in question, the Iranians, violating the terms in myriad ways without any accountability at all.
Right.
And frankly, precious little criticism from the Congress, which is in the hands of the loyal opposition. And that brings me to the last point, which I'm sure you'll find a cheerful interpretation for, and that is the Corker-Cardin initiative. Because it seems to me that once you, when you look at the timeline, Shoshana, and you followed this much more closely than I, as did Sarah, you look at the timeline of the concessions that were made in that process, which they were rewarded for being in, they got vastly worse once it became clear that the Senate was not going to be an impediment to this deal. Once it was certain that the game was rigged, many of the concessions that the Iranians kept demanding and then kept getting sort of came to be. Am I right about that? And
Yes.
Isn't that a bad thing? Or is that a good thing?
Let me rephrase it for you. Are you positive?
There you go. Thank you.
I am
As ever been.
positive that it's a normal thing. If you think that somebody is going to stop you from getting something, that's a problem for you, and you have to worry about how to deal with it. How do I deal with a veto-proof majority? Let's say that there had been a veto-proof majority in the Senate. The Iranians would have to look at that and say, that matters to me. I mean, some things matter and some things don't. A veto-proof majority against me, this matters to me. And then I see that begin to melt away, and I see the president not only, winning the battle, he's not even going to have the thing up for a vote. Then I start grabbing more and more stuff because I can. Because I can. And by the way, what they said about, the president has said there will be no additional sanctions. You know why he said that? Because in the Iranian version of the JCPOA, it says, the imposition of any additional sanctions will be considered a violation of the agreement, and we will no longer be bound by it, by the agreement. So not that the Iranians find themselves bound by it today, but they really want to accuse us of violating it so they can walk away. So that's how they've structured it. All of this represents their view, and it is a correct view, that the more you can get, the more you should get. Don't stop until they make you.
Right.
Take everything you can before they stop you. Well, we haven't stopped them yet, and I'm disappointed. You say I'm going to leave on it down.
No, no, no.
I'm
I'm going
disappointed by the Republican Congress.
Me too. But my last point is, are you happy that you came today? I'm happy that you came today, as
I
I'm
am
sure
happy that
everyone
I
else
came.
is.
I am
Thank you.
always happy that I'm here. Thank you, Frank.